Diversity is about having, in this case, an organisation or an industry that represents all parts of society. That's welcoming, that's embracing. It's not just inclusive, it's not about tolerance. It's actually creating an environment where people want to come because they can be themselves and they can bring their whole selves to work. And that's the best outcome, because then we have people in our organisation that are like our clients, that are like our clients' clients. Then we think more like them, we're more creative, and we come up with better solutions. And it's personally important to me, not just because that seems fair and equitable and we want to treat everyone well, it actually delivers better business outcomes because we're a smarter organisation, because we've got people from all different walks of life believing all different things and bringing them their whole selves to work. WSP Opus's biggest diversity challenge is the same one the industry faces. It's actually the output from universities. So we only have, for example, if we look at gender as an example, we've only got in the early 20% of output coming out of engineering schools are women. So if we want to represent society and have 50% of our workforce as women, and we're not in that position at the moment, and the whole industry wants that, where do we get them from? So we've actually got to wind back a little bit and start addressing the issue at the very early stages and addressing it in school. And Engineering New Zealand's doing a great job at that. Their diversity agendas are a wonderful example. The work they do in schools is absolutely fantastic. So all of us have to get behind those types of initiatives to encourage more, in this case, women to come into the workforce. Also Maori and Pacifica, we've got to lift the numbers of Maori and Pacifica that are involved in the industry. One of the ways we do that is through scholarships and cadetships and bring Maori and Pacifica into the business. And gosh, they're delivering wonderful results. And likewise, they understand part of our client base better than a 50-year-old white guy ever could. WSP Opus has really had a substantial shift in its views on diversity and inclusion in the last couple of years. We've done some concrete things in that we closed the gender pay gap, which was 7.5%. We closed that in one go, and we did that last year. So that's like for like jobs, and that's closed. We've put in place a parenting policy, which tops up the government's 22 weeks. For the time that people are off. We put in place partner leave of 2 weeks as well. And we've also dealt with an issue which was about holiday leave. When people take their holidays, the legislation isn't very generous as to how that's accrued, so we accrue it at their highest pay rate as opposed to the average. That means they get a decent payout as well. So there's some of the concrete things we've done. We've also created a diversity and inclusion action group. So that group provides us, the executive and HR, with advice. They're sort of the pulse of the organisation. They go out and speak to different parts of the business, understand what the important issues are, and help us change those. So there's some of the big drivers. We've also seen an increase in women in leadership. So 40% of my leadership team are women, and that starts to change things because it starts to change the way we think as an organisation. We're also going for accreditation on the Rainbow Tick at the moment. Now, whether we get there or not, I think we can still be doing a lot better. Is sort of a little bit irrelevant today. What we want is a benchmark so we can understand the things we need to work on. I think the little things that make the biggest difference in diversity and inclusion is really our thinking. I've spoken before about some of the big policy changes, but it's actually creating an environment where people can be themselves, and that's encouraged and it's supported. Picking up the language and some of those subtle shifts of languages. When I first joined Opus, it was a bit like an echo chamber. Understandably, lots of people in the organisation looked and sounded like me. Not the broad Australian accent, but the middle-aged white guy. So creating an environment where other voices can be heard, they feel free to speak up and air their views and challenge is really what starts to shift an organisation. WSP Opus is a lot different to financial services, as is engineering. The baseline in financial services, about 50% of the workforce is women. So that means that diversity and inclusion is important, but it's a little bit easier to come by than when you haven't been an inclusive industry to attract people through to education. So they're a little bit ahead of us. The organisation I worked with previously has the rainbow tick and has some quite progressive attitudes in diversity and inclusion. That's great because we can learn from them. And we can take those best practices and bring them to the table. Some of the solutions will take a long period of time, but I think there's really good minds that are focused on them now. Some of them we can start to change today just by changing our attitudes and changing policies. Largely positively. I think in the early days when we made some changes, particularly the pay gender gap, which was 7.5% and we closed. Interestingly, it wasn't just women that got a pay rise. In a couple of cases, the only reason why we could figure why 4 guys were getting underpaid was because of potentially some discrimination there. So we fixed that as well. That caused a little bit of angst for some people that were hanging on to the past. They weren't happy necessarily that people were getting pay rises just because of their gender. I wasn't happy that people weren't paid the same because of their gender. I've got 4 children. I've got 2 sons and 2 daughters, and I can't think about living in a world where I have to explain to my daughters that they get paid less because of their gender. So things are shifting. Now the momentum's tipped, so we've gone through the tipping point, and people know that we're an organisation that is inclusive. Behaviour other than that isn't acceptable. It doesn't mean we haven't got a long way to go and we can't do things better, but I really feel like we've got momentum, and I think the industry's starting to get some momentum too. The results are coming. So we measure, we track, we haven't got, it's always an interesting debate as to whether you put diversity measures in as KPIs or whether you put them in as aspirations. And I think there's arguments both ways. We've seen some shifts in our workforce, so we've seen more women in leadership. 40% of my direct leadership team are women, including those facing the front line. So a lot of times that arguments get skewed by some of the more traditional female professions, like say HR. Well, 2 out of the 5 of my client-facing leaders are women. So 40% of the leadership team are women. That sends a good signal. We've promoted more diversity through our ranks. We've changed our recruiting processes. So we must have a diverse panel, both as the interviewees and as the candidates and as the interviewers. So to make sure some of that unconscious bias doesn't come through. We're tracking it, we're talking to people about it, so really starting to see a shift in attitude. If companies are lagging and aren't on board with diversity and inclusion, then all for them. I don't want this to be a competitive advantage in the future, but geez, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. If you've created a company that's not inclusive, you won't attract the best talent. And that's absolutely critical. That's in our field. That's all we've got is the smarts of our people. If you don't create an environment that attracts that best talent, then you're going to be way behind. And I would ask them, why? So what's the hold-up? And if not now, when? And if not you, then who? Who's going to make that change? When are you going to make that step? Because it's happened. It's already happened, and you're lagging behind, and you're putting your organisation at peril by not creating one that's diverse and inclusive. The industry 20 or 30 years ago, I dare say, looked even more like me, which, some benefits of that. But if everyone looks like me, it's a bit like an echo chamber, and you don't get that diversity of thought. So we're seeing shifts now. A long way to go though, because until we address that input issue through colleges, we're not going to be able to see a massive shift. But that's just talking about gender diversity. We've also got to work on inclusiveness of Maori and Pacifica and getting them come through. But diversity is much more than that. It's actually about embracing different people with different religions that come from different societies that have different sexual preferences, educating ourselves on those, and just being comfortable to allow people to be who they are. So I think most of the organisations in our industry have moved in that path. I know one of them's got the rainbow tick already, which is something that we aspire to. Becca's also doing some great work. We're doing some fantastic work, and I'm sure I've left some others out that are doing wonderful work. But I see at an industry level, we talk about what we need to do, and also to support the real inclusive push that Engineering New Zealand has. Yeah, engaging people is key, because if it's just something that's being done at the top, then it actually won't get momentum. So we did a few things. I personally ran focus groups across the country. I ran about 40 of them. I went into offices, I talked to people about diversity and inclusion. I tried to understand the challenges that we faced, what it felt like at a grassroots level, and what they'd like us to do about it. So I had a massive base of data. We also ran confidential surveys as well for those that didn't feel comfortable talking to me directly. We then set up the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. So this is a group of our organisation's peers that represent them to talk on the different issues of diversity and inclusion, and feed that back through to the executive, through to HR, to help educate the changes that we're making. So that sort of means that you're hearing the voice. On top of that, I talk about it all the time. So I never do a strategy rollout without talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm proud when we do something like close the pay gap or change our parenting policy, and I trumpet that, because by doing that, what I'm trying to say is WSP Opus is an inclusive organisation. If that's what you like, come and join us, and for our people to feel proud as well.